Next up is This Week in Law. I'm Denise Howell. I'm here with Michael Weinberg from Public Knowledge. Rob Pegoraro and Evan Brown are here too. We're going to talk a lot about 3D printing, the intellectual property attaches playing Baccarat over there in Monaco. Lots more next on This Week in Law.
Netcasts you love.
From people you trust.
This is TWiT.
Bandwidth for This Week in Law is provided by Cachefly at CACHEFLY.com.
This is TWiL, This Week in Law with Denise Howell and Evan Brown. Episode 171, recorded July 20th, 2012. Printing friends and influencing people. Enhance your workflow. Send files of almost any size easily and securely with ShareFile by Citrix. Try ShareFile today. For a 30-day free trial, go to sharefile.com, click the radio microphone, and enter the promo code TWiL. Hi, folks. It's Denise Howell, and you have joined us for episode 171 of This Week in Law. We've got an amazing panel for you today. For all you folks who've been emailing, wanting to know more and more about the legal ramifications of 3D printing, we have got the show for you because Michael Weinberg from Public Knowledge has written the definitive white paper on the subject. He says it's just a white paper. I've read it. It's very definitive, and we're thrilled to have him here on the show. Michael Weinberg, hello.
Thank you so much for having me. Hello.
It's great to have you back. Also joining us once again is Rob Pegoraro. Hello, Rob.
Hello.
Hi, Rob. Great to see you. Rob, of course, is the guy about town, the journo about town on all consumer electronics issues. So also great to get your take on the whole 3D printing world. We're going to get to some other topics too, of course. And of course, also joining us is Evan Brown from Chicago. Hello, Evan.
Hi, Denise. Hope your Friday's going well. It's great to be here.
My Friday's going great. Thank you so much. It is always good when we can get together and do the show. So, Michael, your paper, which has been oft cited and quoted, is called "It Will Be Awesome If They Don't Screw It Up: 3D Printing, Intellectual Property, and the Fight Over the Next Great Disruptive Technology." And of course, when you start thinking about 3D printing, your head almost starts to explode because what the capacity is of this technology, nobody really knows. As you point out in your paper, when networked computers first came on the scene, no one could have envisioned Facebook. You know, maybe you could think about something like Craigslist, and if you're really forward-looking, something like a blog. But all of the capacities of the technology clearly haven't unfolded yet. And right now, in the world of 3D printing, the things that I have seen, and I'm sure there are more complex and elaborate things that you can do with more advanced printers, are, sort of the molded plastic things that are cool to think about. And oh my goodness, we had a plan and now we have a thing. And it's really neat to see this sort of emerging technology out there, but you can't really envision where that's going yet unless you have a whole lot of imagination, which you do, Michael. So please tell us, where things are now and where you see them going.
Sure. And I will say that one of the exciting things is that no one really knows where it's going to go. Anyone who tells you they know where it's going to go, they probably don't know what they're talking about. Mm-hmm. But yeah, so 3D printing is kind of at this interesting phase where the technology has actually been around for over 20 years to do this sort of, they call it additive manufacturing in the engineering world. And if you were an engineering student at a big state university or you worked at a big design firm, you probably had access to this technology, or an architect or something like that, for a long time. And you had a machine that cost $50,000, $100,000, maybe $500,000, and it could do all sorts of really interesting things. But a couple of years ago, the first generation of patents began to expire on the 3D printing technology. And what you saw then was the patents that expire were the ones that print in ABS plastic. So that's what you say, kind of, it looks like the sort of molded plastic stuff. It's actually the plastic that Legos are made out of. Mm-hmm. And so some people came together, and there was a project called the RepRap project that first started, and it sort of created this entire industry of people who are building these home 3D printers. The 3D printers that are designed for you to have, they cost when they first started coming out, they were talking about, maybe $2,000, $1,500. There's still a bunch of them that cost in that range, but you're seeing kind of every couple of weeks a new Kickstarter project for an even cheaper 3D printer. There's one, I know the University of Washington, some people there have a $300 desktop 3D printer that actually fits in your briefcase if you are so inclined. But so right now, the technology that's available for most people is all a derivative of this printing with ABS plastic and kind of printing out of super hot, super precisely placed bits of plastic. And we're seeing all sorts of interesting things because it turns out, as we learned with computers before, if you give people a general purpose technology, they'll do all sorts of random things with it.
Rob, are you starting to see with your eye on the consumer electronics arena, these things actually getting some penetration, or is this just in the hardcore geek world at the moment?
It's in the hardcore geek circles right now. I'm not quite at the point where I'm going to review a 3D printer, although I want to. Nothing else I could, I don't know, maybe make some new toys for my daughter to play with.
Well, Virgil in IRC is saying Jay Leno has a 3D scanner and a 3D printer that he prototypes parts for his cars with. And that's, go ahead.
And what's going to be neat here, and also kind of causes a lot of problems, I guess. Think about how copyright got upended once you effectively abolished the scarcity of creative content. You can duplicate a song infinitely at pretty much zero cost and with no loss in quality. And that really changed how we shop for and listen to music. What about when you start to abolish scarcity for physical objects? That gets us into kind of a Star Trek universe, I guess.
Yeah, it sure does. Michael, the Jay Leno example is a good one for some of the points in your article, which are one major point that you make is that you can patent an entire thing, but oftentimes the individual components of the invention are not patented or patentable. So that perhaps Jay Leno is going to be okay from an intellectual property standpoint in cloning out the little bits that he needs for replacement parts. Do I have that right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, one of the things that makes 3D printing really interesting if you are a kind of an IP law geek is that it really provides this opportunity to step away from your computer and be reminded that the entire world is not wrapped up in copyright. Copyright isn't sort of the be-all and end-all of the universe. And so there's all sorts of things in the physical world, in the non-digital world, that aren't protected by copyright certainly, but maybe aren't protected by any sort of intellectual property right. And yeah, parts of cars are great examples of that. Some of those parts may be protected by a patent, but almost all of those parts are functional objects that do things, which means they're outside of the scope of copyright. And as a result, if it's not protected by patent or maybe by a trademark, you can make a copy of it, you can replicate it, and that's the end of the conversation. The person who first designed that, the person who first created it, can't sue you for some sort of infringement.
What's going to happen, when 3D printers get a little bit more advanced and can make things out of components other than plastic? And, the burgeoning throngs of folks on street corners in New York no longer have to sell cheap knockoffs of things like watches or cameras or what have you. They can sell really, really good knockoffs of those things. What's going to happen legally, do you think?
Yeah, I mean, it can get very complicated very fast. But I think one thing to keep in mind right now is we're a long way off from it being in any way cost effective for me to have something in my house that will print, a working cell phone or something like that. But, the bigger question is kind of, okay, this is a new technology, this is a new ability, but it may not be a totally new ability. I mean, the example of the watches is an interesting one. The example of the car parts is also an interesting one. And what it really comes down to is there are already all of these companies that sell third-party car parts, right? If you go to the store and you want a new piece for your car, you don't have to go to the dealer. You can go to an auto shop and get all sorts of these parts. And the reason that those exist is because those parts all fall outside the world of intellectual property law, and they don't need a license. They're sort of all these third-party manufacturers. So what you will probably see more of these third-party manufacturers who have the ability to bring these objects to people and do it in sort of an efficient way, in a way that people want it.
Evan, what do you think we're going to see as this begins to get more and more prevalent? Are we going to see lawsuits? Are we going to see legislation? Are we going to see attempts to crack down? And, look into your crystal ball and tell me what's coming down the pipe.
I'm so glad you asked the question to me like that, because we could sit here and come up with a very long list of the different legal issues that are implicated by these technologies. So I imagine we will see a lot of activity. Certainly, the courts will be presented with interesting fact patterns that they'll need to resolve, applying the traditional notions of copyright law and patent law and trademark law, maybe to a certain extent, trade dress, things like that. Mm-hmm. And that's going to be the first wave of difficult issues that need to be addressed, and that's what Michael is addressing very well in his white paper and in the in the commentary about all these first wave of issues, and looking beyond the horizon, the intellectual property horizon with these issues. There's just a vast unknown realm of uses, or we can sit here and imagine what kind of uses there will be, but this is just so paradigm shifting, this type of technology, that we can't even imagine some of the applications that we'll see for this. But we can look to what smart people have said about this ilk of technology. When I think of 3D printing, I'm reminded of Freeman Dyson's notion of the self-replicating system. This goes all the way back to the 70s, I believe, where, among other things, he said that we could terraform Mars by sending devices to Saturn's moon Enceladus, and then the machines would self-replicate themselves, gather ice there, and then take that back to Mars. And you wouldn't have to launch this extraordinarily large system of spacecraft to do that. You would just send one system that would be self-replicating, accomplish that Herculean task of taking ice from the moon of Saturn to Mars, all with these self-replicating machines. I mean, clearly, we're eons away from that, or at least many steps of progression away from that in the development of the technology. But between now and when we're in a technological reality where those types of things can happen, there are a bunch of intermediate uses of this technology that will present all kinds of interesting issues. I've already seen people talking about how is this going to affect our Second Amendment right that we enjoy here in the United States, the right to bear arms, which is, on a day like today with the news of the Colorado shooting, is those types of issues are kind of front and center. How is it that we're going to regulate the ability for someone to print an AK-47 and the ammunition for it? That it'll especially get more problematic when, unlike the 3D printing technology now, where you kind of have to supply the substrate, the material for this, where these machines can start taking materials from the environment and assembling them away. So there is just absolutely no shortage of uses of this technology that will present innumerable areas that need attention from the law and also from normative adjustments. So law and regulation and court decisions, there's going to be a lot of this as this develops, because it's such a radical new set of opportunities with technology like this.
And Denise, can I hop on for two of those things?
Yes.
Oh, sorry.
Please do.
I was noticing in the IRC, and then what Evan was talking about with the self-replication ability, and that's actually the RepRap project is explicitly its explicit goal is to create a 3D printer that can print itself. So that is very much what's driving a lot of this innovation, the idea that the 3D printer can print another 3D printer. And if you talk, Adrian Bowyer is a professor in England who invented the RepRap project and is the head of it. If you talk to him, he talks a lot in language of sort of symbiosis and getting to a place where 3D printers are useful enough to people that it convinces people to use the 3D printers to print more 3D printers. Sort of this like pollination flower analogy he uses a lot. So it's already, people are very much already not only thinking about it, but taking big steps towards doing it. But as for the gun question, this actually came up in the 3D printing community a couple of months ago because someone uploaded, I'm not a gun expert, but a part of, I think, of an AR-15 that is the kind of the part that the federal government regulates. And there was a kind of a little bit of a freak out. And then this week there was another mini freak out when somebody talked about using a 3D printer to print the keys that you can use to unlock handcuffs. Mm-hmm. And, you know, the question that we really need to ask ourselves whenever these stories pop up, and you're going to see more of them as more people use the technology, is this really a new ability? Because, you know, the country is full of machine shops today, even digital machine shops, that you could use to mill yourself a gun or mill yourself new keys that open handcuffs. And so these things get pressed because someone used a 3D printer, and 3D printer is kind of a new technology, but it's really important to take a step back and ask yourself, okay, is this really a new problem, or is just this an existing problem that you can also use 3D printing to make trouble with?
Okay, I understand. Rob, what do you think, again, looking into the future? I remember when photo printers came out, and certainly there are tons of people who print their own photos, but there are, you know, probably equally as many who just think it's kind of a pain, and they just like to print their text documents when they need to and still, you know, send their photos out for processing if they actually want to have hard copies in the digital age, or, you know, send them down to the local, just send the digital file to the local drugstore, pharmacy, photo processing lab, and that's taken over. So I sort of see 3D printing being the same way, that it's going to be too cumbersome, expensive, specialized maybe for every single person to have one of these in their house in any sort of near time frame. That is, until you can say Earl Grey hot and get your food and other supplies that way. Do you agree with me, Rob, that this is going to be kind of specialized for a while?
I think so. I mean, right now, yeah, if I want to get at there's in the Northeast DC or maybe Tacoma Park, Maryland, there are some of a bunch of cities. San Francisco, there's a really, really neat space called the Tech Shop where you can, there's lots of interesting gadgets you could probably hear yourself pretty badly with there. You can make just about anything. But yeah, as these things get to be cheaper, I don't know, think of like maybe 20 years from now, they'll be just another power tool you keep in the basement. Right. But that doesn't mean there still won't be a market for, you know, higher quality output, paying other people to do the work for you. You know, not everyone buys a circular saw today, even though it's not an expensive purchase. Maybe you just, you know, you may not need one if you know a neighbor who has one who will loan you one.
The other interesting thing I can see happening with this, and another reason why the legal aspect is one to pay attention to, is just as the big box stores came and wiped out, you know, the mom and pop shop that used to sell dishes and home goods, you know, now you get them at Target or Walmart or Costco or wherever you go for this stuff in bulk. You know, maybe they'll get their just reward when you decide, oh, I can just print up my new set of dishes this afternoon and not worry about it. So perhaps it's all cyclical. And Michael, that's not a bad thing from a policy standpoint, right? We want to encourage innovation and new businesses, correct?
Yeah, I mean, it is not a bad thing because it's an ability that people will have, and they're using it in, you know, they may use it in a good way, may use it in a bad way, but the idea that you can then be able to make things that you don't need to go and pay someone else to make anymore isn't necessarily a bad thing or an inherently bad thing. I mean, when people speculate about what happens kind of commercially as this technology goes out, regular printing, kind of photo printing is a good example, right? So maybe you have a printer at home that you use or you don't use, and that's used for some things that are good or bad. And maybe there's a Kinko's or something around the corner that has access to a nicer printer. And you can imagine a world where there's a corner store that that has infinite inventory because they have access to all sorts of digital files, and you just pick what you want and they just print it out, and there it is in the machine they have in the corner store. And then you have sort of the online services that are even higher end, and those already exist. There are companies like Shapeways that you can upload your file to, and they will print it with their $500,000 3D printer and send it to you in the mail. And so that's a way for you to access a very high-end 3D printer without having to own one. But you still can use it and see what it's like, and their turnaround isn't instantaneous, right? It's not like printing it out in your living room, but they get it to you in just a couple of days. And so for a custom piece, that's not bad.
The phrase collective ownership of the means of production just popped into my head, but I think I've heard that somewhere else before.
Yes. Well, Michael, what I really like about your paper is that it is intended to be preemptive. It's as though you were writing to the folks who had come up with the MP3 file format or peer-to-peer file sharing technology before all the lawsuits ensued to make them aware of what was coming. It's called It Will Be Awesome If They Don't Screw It Up. Don't Screw It Up is our first MCLE passphrase for the show. Michael, your conclusion sort of warns people they should be paying attention to these issues. Is there anything more concrete that you can add if there are people in this industry or want to see the industry grow?
One thing that I tell people all the time is it's much easier to make friends in Washington before you need them. So we're kind of at a phase now here at Public Knowledge, and we're doing this thinking is we're introducing this technology to policymakers and people in Congress before there's a controversy, when it's still just a really cool thing to show off. And so we did an event about a year ago where we brought in a bunch of 3D printers and just showed them off. We're probably going to do another it's an ongoing process of introducing 3D printers and those people and those businesses to policymakers. And so if you are if you're building a business on 3D printing, if you are a 3D printing enthusiast, do let me know, because as we do that, as many of you may know, Congress people, representatives, and senators really prefer to hear from people in their districts and in their states. And so the more representatives of states and districts we have, the better we are at building those allies and building those friends before somebody walks in to a congressional office with a 3D printer and says, this pirate box is destroying my business. We need to regulate it out of existence.
I'm kind of struck by something you said there, Michael. You said building these friends. It gave me the idea maybe you should just print some friends and then...
Who says we haven't already?
There you go. No wonder it's going so swimmingly. So good stuff.
The Michael Bot is joining us today from Washington, D.C.
The real Michael's at the beach.
Yes. Good thing on a Friday in July. Well, we're going to take a quick break here. We're here with Michael Weinberg and Rob Pegoraro, Evan Brown, and me, and we're talking 3D printing and other issues of law and policy that affect the technology world. And our sponsor for this episode of This Week in Law is ShareFile. ShareFile, of course, is what you need to be using when you send and receive documents through email, because as things get more and more complicated in the digital world, files get bigger and bigger, our storage capacity is bigger and bigger, but unfortunately our bandwidth pipes tend to remain kind of small, and speed is not what we would hope it to be. That doesn't mean that we don't need to keep sending things through email as part of our workflow, and sending large and important files as regular attachments can also be risky, let alone the frustration of maybe not getting there because it's too big. You might get a bounce back because it's undeliverable. You're not sure who's going to get it on the other end, but ShareFile is the solution to all of this. It's from Citrix, and it makes business communication easy and confidential. With ShareFile, you can send files securely of almost any size. It's so easy to use. All you do is select the document or file that you want to send, and your recipient receives it directly as a link in an email message. You can track down when they download it and set access controls so you know it's secure. Plus, ShareFile has an amazing support team available to answer any question you may have. It's fully customizable. It's a great tool. I use it in my law practice. I find that I use it more and more with things that involve multimedia, such as presentations, keynote kind of files that are loaded up with images and video, and you just can't get that through an email. And yet you need to collaborate on these things somehow, and ShareFile is absolutely the way to go. So to get you started, I have a special offer. You can sign up today and receive a 30-day free trial. That's at sharefile.com, and you click on the radio microphone and enter the promo code TWiL. Remember, visit sharefile.com and type in the promo code TWiL. Thank you so much, ShareFile, for your support of This Week in Law. So, Rob, we're talking about how intellectual property can wind up monkeying around with technologies in various ways. It can even sort of reach forward 6 years into the future and make things that used to work just fine not work anymore. Can you tell us what happened with TiVo and HDMI?
Yes. So this is actually a story I wrote about for USA. We're talking about the usatoday.com thing I wrote about a little while back, right?
Yes.
Yes, this was an interesting little escapade. I do a Q&A column for the newspaper site. Guy has a TiVo, and he plugs it in by HDMI to his Samsung TV, and it says HDMI not permitted. Which, what? Huh? How's that? And then we would also establish that this guy's Blu-ray player also would not work, although in that case the error message was less informative since it just turned the TV screen blank green. And what happened is some part of the TV is no longer speaking what's called HDCP, High Definition Content Protection. It's basically the sort of handshaking protocol where a source device says over HDMI digital connection. And in this case, that broke down, and the reaction in that case is to anything or just to have an error message. Now, the funny thing is, of course, we were able to work around the problem using component video, which is an analog connection. So it's fine, except for the fact that it's analog component input. So it gets to all of this is a problem because of the Digital Millennium Copyright Act, which makes it a crime to circumvent a technology that effectively controls access to copyrighted material.
Hey, Rob.
Box or whatever. Yes.
Rob, your video and audio is cutting in and out, so I'm going to call you back, and we'll pick up this conversation line again when I call you back.
Done.
Great. Let's get back to that with Rob in a minute. But in the meantime, I'd like to explore, because we haven't talked about it on the show yet, and Michael, and I know public knowledge in general, has been paying a lot of attention to the newly introduced Intellectual Property Attache Act, IPAA. Michael, is this SOPA all over again?
It's not full SOPA all over again, but it actually is a piece of SOPA. It's funny, in the wake of SOPA, we've seen a lot of people try and say, okay, well, this new thing that's coming is the next SOPA or the next PIPA or whatever it is. This isn't the next SOPA or the next PIPA. This is actually one of the parts of SOPA basically cut out and turned into a standalone bill. So it's not the part of SOPA that was the one that scared the people the most, but it's absolutely still part of that bill trying to be reintroduced kind of piecemeal.
Which part is it?
So this is the part of the bill. What it is designed to do is to strengthen what are called IP attaches. These are federal employees and who are stationed not in the U.S. but at our embassies overseas, and their job is it's kind of a hybrid job. One is to assist in IP enforcement, although they're not FBI agents, but sort of push that agenda, and then also just sort of talk about the importance of intellectual property with the officials and people in the country that they are stationed. So they're stationed, in all over the world, and they are kind of the intellectual property law cheerleaders for the United States. And this is a bill to kind of expand that program and sort of raise its profile a little bit.
So it's not as scary as SOPA, but it is definitely on the side of the rights holders, this bill.
Yeah. I mean, I think that the parts of SOPA that people were really concerned about were really, really scary. So there will be many things that are merely very bad that don't qualify as that. But I think there are kind of two sets of concerns about how that works, right? So there are two sets of concerns with the bill. The first is with the substance of the bill, because it really does. If you look around the federal government already, there are all of these places scattered throughout various agencies, Department of Justice, Department of Commerce, just all sorts of random places who are tasked with enforcing intellectual property rights and advocating for intellectual property rights. And, that's a fine goal to have in and of itself, but we're increasing the amount of resources we're putting behind this. And so this is just sort of another expansion of those resources. And very often, especially as part of these IP attaches bill, their job is to talk about the importance of intellectual property enforcement, but they're not supposed to. They don't talk very much about the importance of limitations and exceptions, the critical role of things like fair use in how our intellectual property system works. So it's kind of one-sided and one more set of people who are talking about this. So when you talk about the limited resources of the federal government, at some point you need to ask the question, is this a priority enough that we need to put more resources behind it? But so there's that substantive problem. And there's also this process problem. And the process problem was a big part of the SOPA-PIPA fight, which was if you're going to have a bill that has to do with intellectual property, that has to do with the internet, represent it in a very transparent manner and make it available for people. This bill was leaked on a Friday or a Saturday, and there was a markup, which is fairly far along in the process, scheduled for Monday or Tuesday, so 2 or 3 days later. And no one knew about it. No one read it. No one knew what was in it. And the chance to make changes was way too fast for anyone to have any sort of substantive changes made to it. And so it seems like the proponents of it didn't learn either lesson of the SOPA-PIPA fight. One is be wary if you're just blindly doing things that rights holders tell you to do to expand enforcement. And the other one is even if you're going to do it, do that in a way that allows people to at least understand what you're doing and weigh in, because that's how this process is supposed to work.
Hey, Rob, is there any sort of parallel lobbying effort, power in Washington on the part of the Consumer Electronics Association or any sort of consumer advocacy groups that would be able to, if we're going to have intellectual property attaches educating the world about IP enforcement, wouldn't it be nice, we were talking about that TiVo issue, if we had folks out there educating the world about the importance of interoperability in the long term and having your devices that you paid for continue to work?
We do have those groups. We have a lot of them, and they're all individually a lot smaller and less well-funded than the likes of the Recording Industry Association of America or the Motion Picture Association of America. There's Public Knowledge, there's the Electronic Frontier Foundation, there's the Center for Democracy and Technology, there's a new one called the Disruptive Competition Project, or DISCO. There's Engine Advocacy, which tries to get Silicon Valley types to talk better to Washington. CEA is a freelance client of mine. They've been around for a long time. Their sort of baptism of fire in terms of intellectual property was successfully litigating the Betamax case and winning on a 5-4 vote in the Supreme Court. So imagine if one judge ruled the other way. We'd have a much different environment.
Yeah.
But yeah, collectively, it should be a fair fight. But, folks in the content industry have been at this for a very long time. And, unlike a lot of people in the tech business, they don't drop in, make a point, stop a bill, and then go away. They work at this stuff full time, patiently, slowly, and continuously.
So, Evan, I guess healthcare and Betamax hang on one vote in the Supreme Court. Any thoughts on what we've been discussing?
Well, no, other than I guess with the question of the attaches, I see the criticisms to be made of this in as much as it's part of SOPA. But one thing that I am leery or what's the word, leery or weary of, skeptical of, makes me think twice is the argument against these things being that we ought to use our resources in other ways, like to educate people about fair use or exceptions to intellectual property protection or something like that. To me, those seem largely like apples and oranges types of issues. So for the sake of consistency, I much prefer not answering or not, criticizing a piece of legislation like this that may have its downsides with pointing out something that kind of falls into another arena. It's kind of like if you're arguing with your spouse over not picking up your socks off of the bedroom floor, then your spouse mentions, then you say to your spouse, well, the dishes in the sink are always dirty or something like that. There's like this, there's this kind of incongruity between a lot of these issues that I don't like seeing the argument go that way. That's all I really have to say. As far as attaches go, I guess I wouldn't have given them a French name either. That's the other thing.
Yes, I expected them to be
the language of diplomacy.
Yes. Hanging out in Monte Carlo, playing baccarat or something. Rob, let's talk about consumers and their expectations in cell phones. There was an interesting report, a public accounting from the cell phone carriers responding to information about how many times they had offered up subscriber information in response to government surveillance requests. A startling 1.3 million demands last year, reports the New York Times. And at the same time, people seem to feel pretty comfortable that their usage of their cell phone is private. What do you think about this disconnect?
I think it is a certain amount of just kind of either acceptance or maybe just looking past it. You sort of know at some level that, obviously the carrier has to know where you're using the cell phone all the time. Otherwise, how does the signal ever get to your phone? It doesn't just get there by magic. I think, a lot of people think, well, I'm not a criminal. What do I have to hide? Or, if this helps the government catch the bad guys, then so be it. I think it is a problem that we're only learning about these volumes just now. And also that, most of the carriers, Sprint, their letter, they made some good points about, look, the law is not actually clear on what our obligations are to give up location. We would like to see this clarified. And the other ones that just seem to have factored into it, this is just the cost of doing business. And it is a cost. I think Sprint said they had 26 people. There's a room of people that is staffed full-time to deal with these requests.
Evan, what do you think about all this?
I don't have much of an opinion on it, honestly, because I was reading Twitter about something else. So you caught me again not paying attention in class. There you go. This is becoming a pattern.
One other comparison I'd make, if you look at Twitter did a great thing not too long ago. They've posted, which countries, which governments have been asking for information about our users. Google has done a good job of that as well. I think if a carrier had the same sort of real-time database, this is how many law enforcement requests we've processed this month in which places. You couldn't make it too detailed, I guess. You could give out details of investigations. That would get the subject on people's minds a little bit more. But I don't know that, is there a business model to be made there, selling yourself to customers as we don't give you up to the feds? Maybe Working Assets, the company that is apparently, it sounds like they've gone to court to stop a national security letter phishing expedition, which is a very difficult thing to do, and no one else seems to have tried it ever. Maybe they could take the lead on that.
Yeah. Google seems to think there's a business model, at least in allowing people to blur faces in the videos that they upload, Arab Spring being a good example of when you would want to do that if you're a protester and you're attempting to rally support and you're uploading videos to the YouTube service. You now have the ability to blur out the faces of everyone in the video so that they can't be identified that way. Our intern Franklin points out that, of course, the video will persist on other devices in unblurred form, and if law enforcement or other government agency wants to track them down that way, of course, they can use that channel, but it takes out, the centralized and relatively easier means of going to YouTube with a subpoena and trying to identify people that way. But I guess, in response to is there a business model here? I guess YouTube must at least think so. I mean, I'm sure that they would couch this as, we're doing this because it's a good thing to do and a public service, but they must also think that it's marketable, don't you think?
I don't know. Maybe they, I'm trying to think of what other uses you could make of technology that automatically blurs faces. There's got to be some other, I don't know. I guess once you've written, I'm thinking Google's Picasa photo editing app will recognize faces in a photo. So once you have that technology, maybe it's not so much work to port it to video and just have it blur the faces instead of doing anything difficult like fix red eye effects or something. Right.
Michael, any thoughts on these privacy issues?
Yeah, I mean, privacy isn't something that we do here at Public Knowledge, but I have to say that it's funny. I'm in the middle of Tim Weiner's new book about the history of the FBI, and you really did see sort of almost a generation-long situation where the FBI basically felt like it could break into anyone's house and wiretap anyone and tap whatever they want until the law caught up. And the fact that there is or is not a business model to protect privacy, that may not. I mean, as an advocate, I would say that probably shouldn't be the end of the conversation, right? There's probably a role for government to step in and say, we actually need to restrain ourselves because as a society, while in any given case, it may be really helpful to be able to get this information, it is destructive if the government is able to just do it very easily without any sort of review. And so if it's that important to be able to get this information, which I'm no expert, I don't know, maybe it is or it isn't. If it is, let's really make sure that we build a system that safeguards the public's privacy, recognizing that kind of system may come at a cost of law enforcement not getting everything they want. But in the long term, that's a cost that's worth bearing because it makes society more like the society we want to live in.
Couldn't it be said that this actually goes a step further than making it difficult for law enforcement? I'm talking about the YouTube face blurring thing. Couldn't we go so far as to say is that this is actually a tool to help criminals, here in the U.S. do their crimes, get notoriety about it, but actually do a better job at staying hidden? I mean, it's been in recent news here in Chicago. Some kids beat up an old guy who ended up dying, but they were dumb enough to post it I think they posted it on Facebook. I don't think it was on YouTube. But the point is, one of the things that was really driving them was this idea of being able to put their activities on the internet for others to see. Now, clearly, I know that there would be other ways of tracking them down through, forensic investigation other than just, seeing their faces on there. But I haven't seen any criticisms of this thing on YouTube's part, which is in the name of privacy for people, I guess, protesting over in the Middle East and in other parts of the world. I haven't seen any criticisms of how this is really going to do more than what's necessary to not only stymie law enforcement here, but actually provide a tool for this. One final point is that Franklin, our intern in IRC, made a good point. Rob, if you'll remember the last time you were on the show I was hosting, we talked about that Austrian politician who was caught on video performing a lewd act in the woods. He certainly could have benefited from this face blurring technology as well.
It sounds like he needs to blur more than his face.
That's right. That's right. Blurring something here.
I'm sensing this will be popular in Germany too, since they seem to want to blur everything in Google Street View as well. Maybe it's just, a sensibility issue of who wants to be in a public video or not. I guess why would you upload it in the first place if you didn't want to be in it? But
right, but it goes right against a lot of the other norms. It seems like we're always lauding here about transparency and openness and information, being out there. This is, actually a literal opaque layer put between, or maybe translucent, put between the generator of the information and the recipient of the information. And so I just am curious of why the kind of overall knee-jerk reaction is to laud YouTube for this for a relatively limited set of its users, namely those people involved in protests in unsettled parts of the world.
Yeah, I'm sure there are law enforcement people who think this is a really bad idea, and maybe they're right. Maybe things will play out in ways that no one has yet foreseen. So we will keep an eye on that and see how it goes. In the meantime, we have a tip of the week for you. It comes to us from our friend of the show, Michelle Sherman, who's been on before. She has written about the Facebook sponsored story settlement. That's where Facebook was sued by several users under California's right of publicity law. And what she points out here in the piece is what this stands for. There was never a judicial decision. There was a settlement where Facebook agreed to pay $10 million to charity, $10 million in attorney's fees to the plaintiff's counsel, and change some of the ways that sponsored stories work. But the nugget to glean out of here as a tip is that actually, you know, as more and more people go online and do things in public, the right of publicity, I think, is expanding to include Joe Public, as Michelle points out here. I think traditionally you've seen celebrities sue under these laws. It's not that the laws didn't contemplate every individual having a right of publicity, but I think that the technology just hadn't caught up to that being a practical thing to protect. And so this settlement stands for how that has come about. And I encourage you to check out Michelle's social media law applied piece on the subject if you want to learn more. She also has tips for sites that are hosting pictures and things they can do to help protect themselves from being the target of right of publicity suits. Our resource of the week is Michael and Public Knowledge's podcast, which is called In the Know. If you haven't already checked it out, you should. It's very interesting. We've got a link to it in our show notes at our discussion points are at delicious.com/thisweekinlaw/171. And of course, we have show notes over on the TWiL wiki as well. Michael, you do this weekly, is that right?
We aspire to do it weekly. I think whenever we can, we do it. I mean, it's no This Week in Law, but it's a weekly show, usually released about midday on Friday, kind of wrapping up all the tech policy issues that we've been paying attention to during the week.
That's great. Well, if you like our show, I'm sure you will love Michael's as well. Sherwin C. is on it with you regularly or just on the current issue?
He's on the current one and semi-regularly. I am usually on it, and then we have a cast of PKers who hop on and off to weigh in on various things.
So your current one discusses general purpose technologies. I think that relates back to our 3D printing discussion, does it not?
Absolutely. It was a little bit of that and a little bit of the story of all the YouTube rippers and whether or not those were a good thing or a bad thing and whether or not they were kind of a legitimate tool to exist in the wild or we should shut them down because someone can imagine a way that they can be abused.
Right. So a general purpose technology is something that can be used, if we borrow from Betamax, for non-infringing uses as well as infringing ones.
Yeah, I mean, they can be used for general purposes, and sometimes those purposes are good, and sometimes they are bad, and sometimes they are neither. But the fact that you can imagine a bad one doesn't mean that should be the one that kind of defines it.
Indeed. All right, guys. Well, this has been a really fun episode of the show. I'm so glad we were able to delve deeper into these issues. As I told you, Michael, we constantly get questions on the 3D printing issue, so I'm sure that you get peppered with them all the time. Thank you for paying attention to that and for your great white paper on the subject and for joining us today.
It's a fun thing to talk about, so thanks so much for having me on. And for the plug of the podcast. Thank you.
Oh, sure. Absolutely. You can follow Michael. He's at Weinberg PK on Twitter. You're also over on the Google Plus, aren't you?
I'm not on the Google Plus. Actually, I'm very bad with social media. I'm not on the Google Plus. I'm not on the Facebook, but I am on the Twitter.
It's funny, most everybody's. Yeah, MySpace, Friendster.
That's a really awesome MySpace page, actually. So check it out.
Lots of flashing lights.
Yeah.
But it's funny, though, that just about everybody is on Twitter. I don't know what that means, but it does seem to have that level of penetration. Rob is over there. He's Rob Pegoraro on Twitter and is out there writing for many a publication. I'm sure that you're going to stumble across him in all of your reading on technology and consumer electronics issues. Rob, thanks so much for joining us.
You're welcome.
Great to see you again. And Evan, this has been a great show. Thank you so much once again for co-hosting along.
Very nice to talk with you. And just so you remember, 43 years ago today, got the trivia question for you. You know what happened 43 years ago today? July 20th, 1969. Yes.
Walking on the moon?
Yeah, Apollo 11, Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin first stepped foot up on the moon. And Mashable's got a great thing going on today. What if Neil Armstrong had Instagram? They've taken some of the photos from the Apollo 11 mission. And I mean, it's kind of ironic. 1969 is kind of vintage anyway, but they nonetheless have run them through the Instagram filter. So that's pretty cool to check out. But yeah, that was a good day in history of the United States back 43 years ago today. So in any event, good to talk with you, and thanks for having me on the show. Rob and Michael, also great to talk with you again.
Yes, and thank you for ending us on an up note. Folks, we will see you on the next episode of This Week in Law. Thanks so much for tuning in. Hey folks, just jumping back on here to tell you that our second MCLE phrase for episode 171 is IPAA. Let us know how you're doing with that MCLE credit. Thanks a lot.